Hey everyone, Andrew here, and I just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of you that keep coming back to the show every other week. It means a lot, and we appreciate you for it. And with that said, please, if you feel that this show provides value and is helpful, just share it with someone if you think they can benefit from it. It's always our goal to help the community, and one simple way you can help us with that is just to let people know about Indie Game Movement. So that's all I got for now. So thank you again, and let's get to the show. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and this is episode 147, where we're going to be talking about how to nail publisher negotiations. Now, depending on your goals and resources, sometimes your best bet is getting a publisher. And after initial talks, once you receive an offer, there can be a lot of unknowns, especially when it comes to fully understanding how certain agreements can dictate your future. That's why today we have Tim Bender of Hooded Horse Games to share what to look out for and how to approach negotiations so you can be prepared and get the most out of your publishing agreement. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, and we're back. Today we have Tim from Hooded Horse Games. Tim, how's it going, man?
Hi, Andrew. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, we're definitely glad to have you here. So without further ado, Tim, I just want you to kind of take it away, share us what you do for Hooded Horse Games, kind of games that you publish, because you guys are a publisher, and anything else that you like to do in your personal life when you're not working.
Thanks, Andrew. Hooded Horse, we're a fairly new publisher. We have two upcoming titles right now. One is Terra Invicta, and the other is Alliance of the Sacred Sons. Both are space strategy games. Generally speaking, we're focused on strategy, simulation, and role-playing games. If it's role-playing, it's probably the kind that has strategic elements. So basically, strategy in a very broad sense. I run the company, also the founder. There's, of course, a couple other members of the board of directors, my investors and such. And we've got, some people who help us with various aspects, Japanese marketing consultant for that market, general marketing and PR support, various roles like that. But we're a fairly small company and fairly new. In my own free time, I don't have much of that lately because we're a new company, and so it's been a sort of wild journey setting things up. But in the moments I have, I spend time with my dogs and my wife.
Nice. Awesome. Well, yeah, I would say it was with everything that you're doing as essentially, a new company and whatnot. I can't imagine that you have too much time on your hands, even though most people are still kind of indoors and not getting out much in light of this whole pandemic. But hey, at least you're keeping busy and having fun with what you're doing. So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah. And we are having fun right now, though. Probably people will hear I'm a little bit sick. I have a bit of a cold, so still having fun, but a little bit less lately. And I do apologize for any coughing or hoarseness to my voice.
Well, no worries at all, and I'm sure people can understand and can probably relate in some cases if they're under the weather or sick as well. So, all right, well, you know what? We really appreciate you sharing that, but we're going to dig in a little bit further, and how we're going to do that is into the Q-Box round. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Q-Box round is simply just a series of random questions that I've prepared for Tim here, and he's going to give us his quick and fast answer for it. So, Tim, are you ready to enter the Q-Box round?
Sure.
All right. What's your favorite book?
The Silmarillion. Read it as a child, continue to read it every couple of years. Love it.
And I'm sorry, what is it again?
The Silmarillion. It's one of Tolkien's works.
Yes. Okay, I'm definitely familiar with that. I have not read it myself, but it's on my to-do list at some point in time.
It's got an element of less. I mean, it's not trying to be a novel. It's more like reading ancient myths. He sort of constructed
Yes.
ancient mythology, and it's wonderful to read.
Yeah, that's what I remember it as too. Cool. What's your biggest gaming pet peeve?
Well, I mean, I suppose that I'm not a fan of any game that has microtransactions or that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people can relate with you on that. We've all heard the stories of some games that have people didn't like what they did with that. So
yeah, I prefer the old model: sell a complete game for a nice price, and then maybe have expansions with defined content.
yes, I completely agree. If you could be any animal, what would it be?
Probably a dog. I mean, I just love my dogs. Spend more time in the yard with them and such.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. The life of a dog is a pretty good one, and for you cat lovers out there too, I'm sure you could agree with the cat as well. The life of a dog or a cat is perfect. But yeah,
Yep.
That's a good one. What's your favorite food?
I mean, anything fast lately because I've been so busy. So I guess a glass of milk probably.
Perfect. All right, and I know you're busy, but I imagine maybe you could squeeze in some time for this. But what are you playing right now for a game?
So you're right. I don't have nearly enough time to play now that I've actually started, working in the industry. But when I do play, I play games together with my wife. And so it's the sort of game that we can enjoy playing together, sort of like talk about as we go.
Mm.
And just recently we played a game, I think it was called Dominus, which is about managing a group of gladiators on Steam. I think that's it. I don't want to say the wrong name for it. Or Domina, probably Domina. I'm saying right. Sorry, Domina. Yeah, that's it. So it's like a pixel art indie simulation game where you manage gladiators and such. So, my wife, she takes the controls, but if she can't stand my sort of incessant checking to see what everyone's doing, it goes much faster than controlling it. But we sort of talk about it and build our little gladiator group together and have fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I remember seeing that before. I don't think they came out that long ago. But anyways, that sounds really cool and like a simulation gladiator game. Awesome. All right, man.
I think I was using. I think Dominus might be the male version, and Domina is the female version of the word in Latin or something like that. So I was probably showing my lack of education in Latin by missing. You're a female. Play as a woman who owns a gladiator guild, so I probably embarrassed myself. All right, I'll get that out of the way early in the podcast.
No worries at all. Well, definitely appreciate you sharing a little bit more about yourself through the Q-Box round. But without further ado, we're going to get right into our main discussion for today, which is how to nail publisher negotiations. And now, before we get into this, Tim, I would actually like to provide a little bit more context why we're talking about publisher negotiations and such, especially when you're saying you're a relatively new publisher, but at the same time, you have a lot of background and experience with this to certain degrees. So I would, if you wouldn't mind, if you could elaborate a little bit more of your background outside of what you just do for Hooded Horse.
So prior to working in games, I was first a commercial litigator, which is sort of a lawyer who deals with contract disputes, mergers and acquisitions, internal corporate type disputes, that sort of thing. I attended Stanford Law School. I worked at a firm called Fulbright and Jaworski for a while, and then after that, I was a consultant for McKinsey and Company. McKinsey is a consulting group, so we'd go into various large corporations would hire us to go in and sort of evaluate how things are going, make suggestions for changes and the like. I also I also have a background in, I have 2 master's degrees, both from Harvard, one in East Asian regional studies and the other one in East Asian languages and civilizations. One sort of more focused on modern East Asian history, especially Chinese history, and one focused on ancient Chinese history.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. And one thing I'd like to comment to that is that I think a lot of our listeners are very well familiar with, especially from previous guests that we've had on the show too, is it doesn't really mean anything in terms of, or I shouldn't say that. It means a lot where your background is from, and not necessarily has to be from games, in order to show how much value and interesting perspectives you can have by being in this industry. I think a great classic example here is Victoria Tron, who is now the community manager. Was it Inner Sloth Among Us, and her background originally, I think, was going to medical school for a short period of time, and then she eventually made her way to community development. So again, I just want to emphasize that in general, but specifically with Tim here, he has definitely a lot of experience that I think when we get into today's topic of how to nail publisher negotiations, he's going to have a lot of interesting insight to share with us. Well, quite honestly, I'm not going to go any further here. I just want to get in with our kickoff question. So Tim, what's the first step that you think that indie devs should consider when looking for a publisher?
So I think that, so if we're talking about the indie dev themselves going out and looking at the publishers rather than fielding inquiries from publishers to contact them, and I do think it should be, I've seen cases where, because I talk to a lot of people, where they haven't made the decision to look for a publisher, but a couple of publishers start emailing them, and so they start considering it because they got contacted. I think that really ultimately it should instead always be your own decision. Now, a contact from someone else should cause you to maybe make that inquiry, but you should never sort of just be looking for it because someone contacted you, or just because you think you should. So the first step I would say is that you truly assess your situation, your game, where you are, whether you're ready, what the timing is, and what kind of publisher you're looking for. And then you go out and actively pursue what you've decided is the right strategy for you, rather than just sort of letting things happen.
Yeah, I think that's a good one too, because a lot of times, when people are thinking about a publisher and not really putting too much thought behind it, I think a lot of times at face value they're thinking, "Oh, I need funding, I need money," right? But what you're saying, and something it makes complete sense and everything, is really think about your needs and everything else in terms of in a way formulating a plan in terms of what you're looking for, and that being the first step to then reach out. Because otherwise, if you don't have that plan and you're just reaching out aimlessly, you might not necessarily find a good publisher, or you might be getting into areas that you're not familiar with, and there's probably just a lot of things that can come out of that you wouldn't necessarily be prepared for, other than just with that single mindset of, oh, I need money. So I definitely like that.
And I'd also add, there's probably more bad publishers out there than there are good. So you do want to sort of be careful where you're looking. Because it's if you're just randomly seeing who contacts you or looking out there, you're more likely to come up with one who isn't going to do much for you. The other thing is that it is very hard to get significant funding. If you're an indie dev who hasn't done so before, now if you're an indie dev who's put out games in the past, has a track record, that's a different story. For those who are doing maybe their first commercial title, it actually can be really hard to get a publisher who is interested in giving you funding. And now, I mean, at Hooded Horse, we do development funding for our games, but there are good publishers who don't do development funding for first games, but they're still potentially good. At least I would consider them before certain other publishers that may be willing to give you some token amount of money, and it's nice to be offered funding. But if I were a dev and I were choosing between a publisher who had a really good track record with games in my field, who offered that kind of expertise, who, I got a really good, feeling of, and they were just, look, we're not going to give you development funding, but we'll do this job for you, I might take that over somebody who has not a good track record, but who is offering some token amount like $20,000 or $30,000, which can seem like a lot, but really isn't a lot. So yeah, I think that a lot goes into the funding is good when you can get it. And again, like I said, so far we've done funding for both of the projects that we've done, development funding. But it's not, it wouldn't be the only consideration I'd have, especially if it's only what's being offered is a relatively small amount. The track record of the publisher is probably one of the most important things.
Yeah, and I think you provide some good perspective there too, because you're like you mentioned like a token amount, a small amount, and at $30,000 to some people that can be very significant. But at the same time, it those numbers can potentially be relative, and if you're not really familiar with not necessarily the space, but publishing as a whole, that could mislead you a little bit where, wow, 30,000, that's a lot of money, but then really understanding it might not be a lot of money for everything that you may need for your project. So I'm glad you emphasized that point too, because again, these numbers can be really relative to people. And when it's your first time getting approached by a publisher and stuff, it can be really exciting and easily any rational sense can potentially go out the window.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's not. And I do want to say there is a scale to games, of course. So I'm not saying something it's always going to be an unreasonable amount that shouldn't be considered that amount. I mean, it can depend on the scale. I mean, we've tended to work with games. I mean, our games are indie games, but they're on the larger size for indie games, both Terra Invicta and Alliance of the Sacred Sons. So development funding for them is a couple $100,000 or something reasonable for them. But there are indie games to which something like $30,000 might be a reasonable amount of development funding. If it's not like years of development, but it's a shorter game to develop, it doesn't have as much cost. I'm not saying that's blanket unreasonable.
Right.
It wouldn't be the thing that would cause. You should never sort of get starry-eyed just because there's money being put on the table. You really want to dig into what the publisher has done in the past.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. Now, I want to kind of take this overall topic that we led in with and dive in a little bit further with it in terms of the current publishing landscape. So what is that like now? And how are there any particular warning signs that devs should look out for if and when they're being approached by any publishers?
So the thing is, I end up collecting a lot of sort of stories because I hear a lot of pitches, and and most of them I have to pass on for various reasons. There often isn't anything wrong with the game. It's just it doesn't fit into the release time they want to do. We can't do that time, or doesn't fit with games and such. But I end up basically staying friends with, or so far, with pretty much everyone I've talked to, and we end up having a sort of continuing dialogue. So devs will come back to me and talk to me about other publishers they're talking to, and ask me what I think of what they're hearing and such. So I do end up collecting a lot of stories from devs about what's going on. So I do have, and of course, I'm not going to name any names of other publishers here, but right. I have seen a lot of approaches that I think are sort of questionable. For instance, there are publishers. I've heard of a publisher, for example, taking one example. One developer I've talked to, they're getting emails from a publisher that's basically, telling them, oh, you're never going to, you need us. You're never going to succeed on Steam with this amount of, wish list you have, and you got to go with us, and then we'll make you visible on this. But I told the dev to look into them. This is what I tell everyone to do: is go to that publisher's past releases on Steam and upcoming releases and see what's going on with them. And it turned out that publisher had exactly one other release, happened to be in the same genre as the developer they were contacting, and it had 20% as many wish lists as judged by estimate from the followers. So basically they're emailing saying, look, you need us because you're so small, you're never going to get noticed. And they got another game that they've been doing nothing for, really, in comparison. If that's true, it's even more true for the game that they let down then, because it doesn't have even as many wish lists as the one they're emailing. So I think what you end up with is a lot of publishers, there's a lot of small companies trying to be publishers, and that's great in a way. But sometimes there's people who try to represent themselves as the golden keys, who aren't quite there yet. And you want to look for someone who's honest with you and sort of talks to you about your game, and not someone who's, I think, right away telling you why you desperately need them and you're not going to succeed without them. I would be worried about anyone who's approaching from that perspective.
Yeah, because a lot of times it's not really. I mean, sometimes I wonder myself why people would approach things that way, but obviously they do. But at the end of the day, it doesn't come off as being very genuine in terms of, or at least not just that, but also open up to a communication. And like you said, an important aspect too is if they show interest in the game outside of like, hey, let's we're willing to help you, but like, do they show anything else beyond that? Like, did they call out to something in the game? I mean, just a little something extra that could showcase that they care about the project, not just at the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I am really sort of a like everyone. The thing to realize is that everyone's being a salesman. Everyone who talks to you is going to take one of many approaches. They might play off your fears, or they might try to
Mm.
be your best. They might tell you how they're different than all the other publishers and they'll look out for you, or they might just like dangle hopes in front of you for like what you could achieve and how great things could be. But ultimately, everyone's being a salesman. And what you got to sort of just the base assumption has to be that the publisher, that you're not like the special true love of the publisher and they're going to do more for you than they did for anyone else. So, what I would advocate doing is if you're looking at a publisher, the first thing you do is you look at their other games. And now, if they've got past releases that are out, look at the number of reviews on those games. And you can do a simple calculation, which I'm sure you talked about here on the podcast, to estimate it. You can go to SteamDB, but basically look about the likely sales that their other games have had. And if they don't have games out, which is I think I'd say is fine because I'm a publisher that's still we're new and we've got 2 upcoming games. But then I'd say judge them by their wish list numbers. And you can estimate those by looking at follower counts. You can go into
Yep.
the top wish list to see where they rank. Either way, though, you need to judge them based on what they're doing for other games, and don't assume that you're different. I've actually heard this because there was one I was talking to a different dev, and the publisher that was talking to him was just telling him all sorts of represents that as the biggest thing, all sorts of promises, and like their past. They had one released game and it had like 20 reviews out there. And I'm not saying a game with 20 reviews is bad, but it does not match what that publisher was telling that developer they were going to be able to do for them, which is just like, we're going to make you rich and you're going to be the biggest game and everything. And, and that's the thing is you just figure that they're going to do for you what they've done for other games.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it for sure. So just look up their past history, see what else they've been able to help out. And another thing too is don't feel if someone's approaching you, don't feel bad about reaching out to maybe those developers too to get maybe a firsthand experience as well.
Yeah, that actually gets into a problem. I mean, I know we're probably going to chat about contracts later, but
Yep.
one thing that's disturbingly common is to have non-disparagement clauses in contracts where the developer is contractually mandated to never say anything negative about the publisher. Now, we don't put those in our contracts. So because I think there's just a basic, well, first of all, I think there's a moral principle there. And second is, I don't know, I wouldn't trust if someone isn't going to let people who had a bad experience talk about it. I mean, the job of the publisher would be to make sure their developers have good experiences and want to talk about them, not have a contractual provision to prevent it. But that is incredibly common. In fact, of the publisher contracts that I've seen so far, I don't remember seeing one that didn't put a non-disparagement clause. And really, that should change. That shouldn't be part of contracts.
Yeah, and maybe too if it isn't a situation where they reach out and they're like, I'm not supposed to say, or oh, it's okay, it's great, and there's no other information, like that could be an indicator that might be the situation for that developer.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's the thing is that like if they're not willing to say anything or if they seem kind of guarded, you can sort of read into that. I agree with that.
Yeah. Well, speaking about this, and you mentioned it earlier about in terms of like small publishers and stuff, I'm curious, can the size of a publisher matter in terms of what indie devs may be looking for, or more importantly, what they need?
Yeah, here's, in looking at that, I think that I think it can, but it's going to just vary so much in terms of what that publisher does and what the implication that size are. So to take some examples, I think that although a lot of publishers will talk about like their reach and, the past gamers they have, I think that's actually true of very few publishers. And, I think there's very few publishers that like people will buy their game just because it's one of that publisher's games. Now, those publishers, and I mean, we probably could name who they are because people do trust them. I mean, frankly, a game that is published by Paradox will instantly have a huge audience. Now, it's just absolutely true for them. That having been said, it's really not true for almost, there are just count them on like, 10 probably across the industry who have that kind of status with players.
Right.
They might have status with people in the industry. They might have relations with media and such, but that players actually look to and look to a standard of play. So I would go ahead. I would never assume that just because a publisher like has a lot of has been around a lot, that's going to have really any reach. That having been said, some things can help in that. If a publisher is focused on your genres, I think that really helps. And so because players will come to recognize that. And I guess we go back to the Paradox example. I mean, Paradox is a very good example of that. They're recognized for certain kinds of games and loved by the people who love those games. And I think that helps in that. If a publisher becomes too broad and it's sort of every kind of game, I think that even if they're rather big, it's very unlikely they're going to end up having that kind of loyalty where they bring draw just from that. That's one of the reasons why with Hooded Horse we're going rather narrow in a way, and everything focused on strategy. So I wouldn't think, outside of a few exceptions, that the publisher itself is going to do much by being the publisher. What they're going to do is mostly they're going to do things actively to help you. And in that sense, whether they're big or small is probably less important than how active they are for the games they're doing. And you can kind of see this because, the best way to judge it is ultimately results. I mean, You can look at how games are performing on Steam DB and such. You can see their other games and whether they're actively doing things for them. You can also see what they do when games are sort of like struggling a bit. I think one way to judge a publisher is, there are publishers out there who sort of, big and small, who seem more inclined to just sort of like let a game be out there. And if it succeeds, maybe they'll do something for them. But it's all sort of like, if not, well, then they're just kind of cut their losses and be done with them. That's less, I think, encouraging than a publisher who looks like they're going to try to support the game. And they're going to try to do whatever they can for all their games. And I think that's another thing you want. So I would try to... Yeah, and these things are sort of get independent. I know you asked about size. They sort of work differently depending on the size, I think. But size itself would not be the concern for me. It's really how active are they in doing things.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a better way to approach things, because I think sometimes it's this well-known publisher and everything else, where if that opportunity happens for some indie devs, and let's say, it's a well-recognized brand, that's a big deal. Whereas this other small publisher, I never heard of them before, right? But to your point, it shouldn't be like size that matters. It should be like, what's the activity? What is their focus? What is their goals when it comes to your project, or even just their portfolio? How diverse is their portfolio? Is it really focused? Those are the factors. And what is that relationship going to look like? Is it right up to release date and then done, or does it go beyond that? Because those are also very important things to matter. Yes, we know, or it's somewhat general, that the first week that your game goes on sale is going to make up for a big percentage of what your overall earnings are going to be for the year. But that doesn't mean there's not potential to still capitalize on that time frame. And if some people just drop it right after that time frame or whatever and don't do anything else with it, is that important to you, that they keep that partnership lasts beyond that? I would say anybody would probably say yes. So looking out for those types of things, I agree with you completely.
Yep, absolutely. And on that last point of sort of, especially with the area that we do, which is sort of strategy games, they have such potential for long-term sales if they're supported and expanded after release. So, one of the things that we talk to when I talk to developers is I talk to them about what their long-term plans are, because I basically want to make sure they're on board with that plan if the game does not stop at release, that this is a longer-term project. And I think from the other side, developers should talk to publishers about that, because it's, I know this directly because at least one developer has told me this. They got a bad feeling about a publisher because they said to the publisher, let's talk about what we're doing after release. And the publisher was explaining to them, it doesn't really matter. It's all about release. And then we're sort of done anyway. And, that's probably fine. And if there are certain games where that might be what the developer is looking for. And I'm not knocking that at all, because there are many different kinds of games. But if your kind of game is the kind where it does benefit from that long expansion and support after release, where release is really just the beginning, which strategy games are. And if you have that approach yourself, you want to find a publisher who is also looking for that kind of developer and that kind of approach, because that's what's going to lead to that long-term support.
So without backing up too much there too, I think an important thing that we're uncovering here is basically whether you're approaching or looking or being approached by publishers and talking about what that partnership may look like. Knowing your market is a really important thing, like really knowing your market, because to the point you just made, if your game has a longer shelf life, then maybe you should partner with a publisher that identifies with that or understands that, opposed to someone who might have a lot of open channels and reach, but might not necessarily understand or really focus on that market that your game is for. So know your market, I think, is a good one. We could probably walk away from all that.
Yeah, and I'd also say, on the issue of channels, I mean, it's nice to like go to a publisher and see they've got this many Twitter followers. The truth is that's never going to lead to much sales. Their Facebook followers, their Twitter followers, their Discord size. I mean, it's all nice, but it's a drop in the bucket to anything that actually happens. What really matters, what you have to focus on, is what they're going to do to actively market your game, because that's what's going to determine whether they contribute.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we talked a lot about these, potential, getting in front of publishers, reaching out to them, and everything else. But let's take it to the next step, where, all right, there's someone out there listening right now who's done all this, and now they're getting in an agreement, an offer, and getting into the negotiation process. So, when that whether it's happening now for someone or when it happens for someone, if a dev is getting their first offer from a publisher, what is a good mindset for them to have when they're looking at all of this and potentially getting starry-eyed?
I think the first thing that I would say is that it is a negotiation, that you should look at whatever offer you get as the beginning. And you'll probably hear from the other side, maybe not probably, potentially hear, I've heard this a lot, that, oh, this is the way it's done. This is the way we always do it. And those sort of answers. Sometimes that's true. Often it's not true when the other person says it, and it's just the way they're trying to stake a hard position in contracts. If it is true and there's something you truly want or need that isn't in there, but they're just not budging on principle of not negotiating, which is a pretty bad principle, then that should maybe give you pause about working with them. So I would look at it as the beginning of the negotiation. I would also look at it as what you first hear from them is like the standard thing, but it's now time to ask yourself what you care about. So, one example, so for instance, if you care about let's take, for example, let's say that you're older, you have kids, you've already poured a couple of years into the project. And one thing that's very important for you is getting a minimum level of financial security. Then what you need to be negotiating for is to make sure that you get a decent salary while development finishes. And that needs to be paid for. Because the default of the publisher might be to expect you to continue the sort of bootstrapping startup experience of, taking almost no money and, just hoping for the eventual success of the game to pay for it. And I'm not I'm not attacking that as a model. Frankly, it can make sense for people in certain circumstances, but if it doesn't make sense for you, and if you'd rather have more security at the expense of maybe, because ultimately things are trade-offs, at the expense maybe of taking a little bit less revenue share at the end, then you need to try to get what's important to you and what's your own goals there. The second thing I'd stress is that you should never look at the projections based on whatever you're seeing, based on, okay, what if things are wildly successful? And where do we end up in the end? Instead, what you should ask yourself, not that you can't look at that too, but the first question you should ask yourself is cash flow. It's what happens in the months after release, especially if things aren't going phenomenally well. And what happens to me, looking at yourself and your ability to live, and what happens to, if you have teammates or other staff, what happens to the ability to keep them on and keep that going. And you need to basically start asking yourself about the timing of dollars, not just dollars. And that's important because a lot of provisions that don't seem that onerous can actually be quite onerous. For instance, many publishing contracts have it in where the publisher pays the developer quarterly and has 30 days to pay. And what that can mean is as much as 120 days after, after the publisher receives funds, and Steam will take a while to get the publisher's funds. So you could end up with the better part of half a year between the time when sales happen and you actually get dollars, right? I mean, you can 90 days, 100 days thereabouts before you start seeing anything. And that can be an important 90 to 120 days, right?
Right.
And so what you have to ask yourself is cash flow. Is this going to be a situation where I'm starved for cash immediately after release, and then potentially I'm forced to lay off my loyal staff, which is terrible, especially if you want to do post-release support or you're planning to do future games and build a studio. You don't want to be so starved for cash you can't pay your people. Or are you going to end up in personal hardship yourself? And that's partially about, I mean, I honestly think that developers should ask for monthly instead of quarterly payments from publishers, at least for the beginning period, meaning the first year after release, it should be monthly, or the first 6 months, because frankly, quarterly is really not, in that initial period, it can cause some hardships. The second thing you need to be thinking about is the impact of recoup. Now, I have no idea why the video game industry settled on 100% recoup as the standard contract term that every publisher expects. It seems to me like shooting yourself in the foot. The publisher invests in a game, it's interested in long-term success, and a 100% recoup term is basically denying the developer needed cash flow and funds to support and expand the game in that critical post-release period. It's not a very good idea to have that contract term, in my mind, from anyone's perspective. But one way or another, most of the publishing industry still operates on asking for 100% recoup. And that is something, and this is, of course, I should define terms first, I suppose, but this is where the publisher asks that their expenses all be paid back 100% before the developer sees any money at all. And there's no particular reason why it should be that way. In fact, I'd struggled to find, that's not the usual model for investment. So I think one of the first things a developer should consider is whether they should ask for something other than 100% recoup term. To ensure that they get some cash flow. Now, it may be legitimate for the publisher to get a higher rate at the beginning while they recover certain costs, but it doesn't need to be 100%. It can be 75%. It can even be 50% in some circumstances. But basically, try to not have 100% recoup term, I'd say, because 100% recoup could mean even if your game is going to make money, it doesn't make money for the first, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, or a year for you, and then you can't continue support, especially you combine with quarterly terms. You can have a situation where a game is going to be profitable for everyone, but the quarterly provision plus the recoup could leave that developer spending 9 months without seeing a dollar, and that is just going to kill your ability to build a studio and look toward your next project as well as support that one.
Yeah, I want to take a quick analogy here just to kind of paint a different way to look at this. Going to the film industry, specifically with theaters, especially pre-pandemic. But so a lot of the agreements with films when they come out, the theater gets 20% of ticket sales, and then obviously the maker of the movie gets 80%. And the longer that the term goes for, then those numbers start shifting in the opposite direction. So 70-30 and so forth. That's one reason why why concession sales and cost of popcorn is so through the roof, is because they're trying to make up that low 20% that they're getting. And that's why they also look for box office hits. So the longer that it's out there and doing well, the more money that theater is going to make. But even though it's a crazy 80-20, at least there's some flexibility there, and they're making something off of those initial film sales too. Because if you think about it, if it were 100%, there'd probably be a ton of theaters and even chains that would probably going out of business because it's not very common you get huge blockbuster hits coming out all the time. So just to take it back to kind of what Tim was saying, and feel free to chime in too, having that flexibility at least provides basically a form of cash flow, so there can create some form of sustainability. It might not be ideal to what you're looking for, but having that flexibility can at least give you more to work with, more decisions that you can make. So whether it's involving your team or your livelihood, it can help out there. So looking for those types of arrangements, whether they're being offered or just simply asking, is it possible? And that's, I guess, a good lead into another quick question is, if people see that it's 100% recoup, like, and they might be nervous for asking for more, but like, what's good ways to approach that in terms of if they see that type of offer in their agreement?
So I wish I could say that there's like a great way you can definitely negotiate your way out of it. The current state of the game publishing industry, 100% recoup terms have become very common, and I think you're going to get a lot of resistance, including from otherwise good publishers. So I don't know. You should definitely try to get it changed. And I would make the points that I'm talking about, that basically we all benefit from ensuring that I, the developer, have some cash flow during that period to help make sure that the game continue to be developed and supported. You may get resistance there. If you get resistance there, I mean, the first thing you might try is see if you can negotiate, because sometimes it's a weird thing, but companies can get so used to doing things certain ways, they get inflexible about certain things, but they're willing to agree to other things that amount to the same thing in all logic, but honestly just aren't outside what they do. So, they might agree to it. So if you can't get the 100% recoup term changed, the next thing I would ask is to try to get the development funds that the company is giving you, to be increased and extend over the post-release period. And surprisingly enough, I think you may have, in some cases, better luck doing that just because of the way people are unwilling to change certain things about contracts. In other words, maybe you can't give them to just give you a percentage of the sales immediately after release, but you can convince them to give you more straight out funding after release, to support, simply because that doesn't register in their minds as being something they don't do. So you might try that and asking for that. And then in the end, I mean, you may end up in the situation where if you can't negotiate for that, for either of those, you may end up in the situation where you have to ask yourself whether it's worth doing the deal anyway. And the thing is, it can be. There are very, very, very good publishers out there who have contract terms that I don't think are great contract terms, but I'd rather sign a contract with them than I'd sign a contract with a publisher who does not do a good job for their games, but is willing to offer you really good contract terms. So, that's the thing. You're probably ending up in a less than ideal situation in some fashion at some point, and you may have to just make a hard choice there. But that hard choice may be walking away. And part of what you should do is analyze the extent to which you need a publisher, because you need to understand your position and your bargaining power and your ability to do things independently. This goes into another point, which is that a lot of publishers offer very similar deals to everyone they talk to. The truth is, games are in very different situations. You should be looking at your own game situation. If you're building up wish list well, and you're headed towards something that's going to be a pretty good success, then that doesn't mean a publisher can't help, but you should be very selective, because you can do it without a publisher then. You'll be okay without a publisher. And the thing is that, this is similar to the issue of, in general, startup investing, inviting venture capitalists in and selling preferred stock, which is where they have something called liquidation preference. If you're headed towards a moderate success, you can very quickly turn that into a total financial failure by signing a bad deal if it guarantees the other side gets all of their expenses paid back before you see a dollar, because that could end up absorbing everything. So if you're headed towards a moderate success and you're building wish list well on Steam, and maybe it's not going to be a dream, maybe the publisher's dangling in front of you the dream of what could be, but the other thing it could be is they take all the money. We know and this isn't just inexperienced devs. I mean, I don't want to name names, but I think everyone, by looking a little bit, can see really promising games that got killed by really bad publishing deals with 100% recoup, and the developer basically had to abandon the game after release. And it had promise and could have made money, but because of that publishing deal, it didn't. And so you really have to understand that if you're headed towards a moderate success, especially if you're an indie dev, this is one of your first games, it may be best choice to just take your moderate success and build where that takes you. And, or if you are signing a publishing deal, frankly, don't agree to 100% recoup. Because I'll say this, if your game has virtually no wish list, desperately needs a publisher, the publisher can do all the, marketing and take it to where it goes, maybe you can justify 100% recoup. But if your game is headed towards a moderate success, so the publisher is coming in with already a good solid amount of wish lists and it's building up and such, then there's no reason in logic or fairness that they should get all their expenses paid back, because they're coming in with half their work already done for them.
Yeah.
Their work is half, it's already done. You've done that work. You need to be getting, some of the first dollars.
Yeah. So again, I think it just goes back to your first initial point is really, but now we have a lot more context to this too. Really looking at yourself and what is it that you really need? What you think you might need might be more of a want, right? But looking and analyzing yourself in the game's progress so far in terms of the reach and what type of awareness it has created. Looking at those things are really going to help you move forward with these types of decisions, and whether you're about to make a good one or maybe not the best one.
Yeah, and it's another thing to consider in all of this is, and it's to a greater or less extent depends on the publisher, but there are a lot of publishers out there who basically their business model is sort of riding on potential successes, watching if among the ones they're in, so they may do publishing deals with multiple games. They watch them. One looks like it's going to be a success. Now they're investing in that one while they let all the others dangle on their own anyway. And you do want to watch out for that. And there are certain terms that you'll find in publishing contracts that sort of point towards that. One thing that and this is somewhat rare to see, having, but frankly, I don't think this should be a term, or somewhat rare to. Sorry, apologies. Coughing. So this is somewhat. At least I've seen it quite commonly in publisher contracts where they have a term that allows them to terminate for convenience, and that can be called different things, but often it's called termination for convenience. Though you want to look at the substance, because you want to look for any term in the publishing contract that lets the publisher simply say, "We changed our mind. We're canceling the publishing contract." Those terms mean the publisher can entirely just, they basically have an option to publish you. They can speculate into the point. They can cut their losses at any moment. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's a killer if the publisher is otherwise good, because again, a lot of really good publishers use bad contract terms like that. But it should give you some pause, and you should consider it, because it means that you have to look at whatever milestones they're paying you on and realize that they also have the option to simply midway through cut all funding. And you have to then treat every bit of future funding that you haven't yet received from them as speculative, as something they may or may not do depending on their own interests. And then one term that I would really watch out for, and I, is any term that sort of like basically there's a lot of things. I would watch out for any term that sort of like allows them to terminate for convenience and still retain the financial interest in the game's success. And that's more rare, I think. I think, a lot of good publishers wouldn't use something like that. But you definitely don't want that to be in there. If they're going to have a termination for convenience clause, it needs to be they terminate for convenience and that's the end of it. And, they're out, fine, and you're on your own. If they can terminate for convenience and then still collect money from you later, that's a clause to be very concerned about. You also probably don't want to do any, you don't want to do any deal where they're not like promising you that they will actually publish your game. I've seen some publishers approach devs about this where they say, well, we'll decide later, but they want to sort of sign the contract now, but they're not putting their name on it. That's something to watch out for. You want to look out for, and I would also say you also want to look out for any deal that doesn't require the publisher to commit something to it. For instance, and it can be any number of things, but if the publisher is not giving you development funds, they need to be, I think, guaranteeing some amount that they're going to spend on advertising and such. And there needs to be some guarantee somewhere in that contract that says they will do things that are beneficial to you, whether that's giving you money or spending money on your behalf. And it needs to be pretty solid. Like they should be giving you a number. There should be a minimum marketing spend guarantee, in there that they will spend at minimum that amount. Because otherwise, they're not really promising you anything. That's the thing. If it's a contract that doesn't give you any development funding and they don't promise any minimum marketing funding guaranteed, then they're effectively promising you nothing. And you're promising them a share of your sales because they talk about their mystery expertise in marketing and how good they do for games, but they're not promising you anything. There's actually nothing you're definitely getting from that contract. They can just ride it to see what's going to happen otherwise, speculate on it, and then jump in later and do something if they decide to. So that's a contract I'd be very wary from. If you hear, if you're looking there and there's no minimum guarantees, no minimum amount of spend they're doing. And then finally, I would also watch out for, you want to make sure that if they are guaranteeing you that they'll spend money on, say, marketing your game, that doesn't mean them just paying their own internal overhead cost and billing it to you as marketing. So, like them spend, you want to see that they're going to spend money out there in ways that are outside their company, not just like, oh yeah, well, we've got Tom and Sally in our marketing department and they're going to like look at your game and do their magic. And then later you're going to see a bill that says, oh yeah, see, we spent $20,000 on marketing your game because we pay Tom and Sally their salaries, and that's $20,000, and we apportion that to your game. That's not real. That it really isn't. And that's not me saying that it's illegitimate for publishers to have some amount of sort of like directed activity, or even just like some or external contractors that they hire, or even just like staff that is definitely doing your thing that forms a small part of the total marketing expense. But if all they're really doing, all they're really doing is just assigning staff to work for you that they would have on staff anyway and be paying anyway, and that's the only thing they're doing, that's a concern. Again, they really haven't promised you anything at that point.
Yeah. So, well, there's definitely a lot of good publishers out there and everything. And not only that, there's probably a lot of good publishers too that have, good intent. Those are definitely still some things to look out for, or at least be aware of, which brings me into our next session as we start to close, is like lessons learned. So in light of everything you just shared there and earlier, what are like the best kinds of questions that devs should ask publishers when they receive an offer or when they see some of these types of things come up that you mentioned?
So, I think the best questions are going to get to how the publisher sees their role and how they do business, but you're not always going to be able to try. I mean, this is the thing. I don't think you can fully trust the answers you get. And that's not like a dig on anyone, but everyone who talks to you is being a salesman. They, more or less, I mean, the more honest ones will acknowledge they're doing it, right? If anyone's ever telling you their motives are entirely altruistic, then you really start doubting them at that point. Everyone's being a salesman. So you're going to ask them questions. I think observe how they answer and how they think of it. And I wouldn't ask like, well, what, I would try to sort of like go through scenarios with them and ask them how they'd approach it. But again, the answers you get may not be what actually happens. And you may not even be talking to the person who's the decision maker. If it's a larger publisher, the person you're talking to may not actually be in a position to make the final decision on a lot of things. So I would put my focus on digging into their past track record with games, looking at the past games they published. Like I mentioned earlier, I know I'm coming back to that, but I think that's what you can trust, is you can trust what they're doing for those games. And if they're released, how many reviews do you have? If they're unreleased, what are their wish lists doing? That's really the truth of what's going on and how they approach things.
Yeah, and I want to say, I think that's an amazing point, because this is just coming from me, from my perspective, in terms of like my understanding and knowledge, especially with marketing. For someone like me, let's say, asking questions, it might be very specific and related, and like you said, providing scenarios and seeing how they respond to that. But that won't always reveal some stuff. And again, to the point where if you're working with a big publisher, they might not know that, and you might never get an answer, or at least a very specific or direct answer to such a specific question. So again, even for someone out there that's more like me, that's like, hey, I have this really clear understanding. I think I could get the answers I'm looking for by being very specific here. That the point is that you're making is very applicable to anyone, regardless of your background or understanding of things. Is what's their track record? Like in some ways, to an extent, you're only as good as your last performance. So look at the last performances. If they've been really good, and these games are getting exposure from partnering with them, then that's clearly a good indicator that they're doing something right and whatnot. Yeah. So I like that approach a lot.
And the other thing to all this is, in terms of like getting answers, is that publishers, the people talking at publishers, are salesmen, and they're also plugged into what indie devs are talking about and what they're concerned about. And they're responding to that, and language is phrased in a way to alleviate that in a way that may not reflect the substance. And one good example is something that has, I don't know, in the past several years has become something indie devs talk about a lot, is the idea of owning your own IP and retaining your own IP. And that's become something, it became something some years ago as a marker for a good publisher that has, that is giving you a good deal. And the thing is, publishers adapted to that. And so now the vast majority of them, I think, or at least a large amount of them, will, make clear, oh yes, you own your own IP. We're not taking your IP. The truth is, a good portion of that time, that's just language and it's hollow. Because getting into sort of like a couple legal terms, there are two ways in which, well, there are multiple ways, but there are two ways relevant to this in which IP can be transferred in some sense. One is a license, the other is an assignment. And what they mean is they're not having you assign your IP. So technically you're the owner, but they are all having you license it, because a publisher cannot do the job of a publisher unless you license them the IP. The question is how broadly you license it. And I've seen publishing contracts where the license is so broad that it basically applies to everything, including future games. And so you end up in a situation where, yes, technically you still own your IP. You haven't assigned it to anyone, but the publisher's got the right to make the sequel and whatever it wants, or do anything it wants, basically, with the IP. So in what sense do you own it? It's like you own a house, but you've rented it to someone forever. You don't really own it anymore. So the point is, the words got all right. The salesmanship responded to the words that indie developers are concerned about, that is owning the IP. But the substance deviated from it, and in such a way as to honestly be deceptive about what's actually going on. So now, happily, I don't think that's all that. That's at least not one of the things that I think is dominant among publisher contracts, but I have seen it before, and I think it is happening. So you want to watch for that. Just because they say you own your IP, what does that mean? What is the extent of the license, that they're taking? And they do need a license. Don't get me wrong. You can't publish a game without a license that needs to be there. But, make sure that you've got, that doesn't extend to where they can just make the sequel without you, because at that point you don't own the IP.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. And a couple quick points I want to make. So going back to when you mentioned about like they know what type of language, they really understand, indie devs and what's like really good ways to communicate with them. You know how on the show we always talk about, and this is to the listeners, know your audience? Well, guess what? You guys are an audience for publishers. And it's not saying that they're trying to be manipulative or anything like that, but as a publisher, indie devs is their audience, so they're really knowing them. So to the flip side of that, like we've been talking about today with Tim here, is know your audience in this scenario, in this instance. So yes, we talk about players, but when it comes to publishers, know them. So I'm just going back to everything that we've discussed today, is really get to know them, see if everything that they're doing, their track record, what they represent, their portfolio, all those things align with what you're looking for and everything else. And then for the second point, now, Tim, you mentioned a lot of kind of like specific terms and other things that I think for some people here it could get maybe a little bit overwhelming when they're going over these things. So when you do get an agreement, an offer, a contract, whatever, it's probably still advised to definitely seek some type of legal help to review these things so you can have a better and clear understanding of them. Is that a good, safe assumption?
Oh yeah, I'm not going to consult a lawyer. I will say you should consult a lawyer, but you should also read it until you understand it.
Yeah.
The truth is, these things, a contract is written badly if you can't understand it, and
Good point.
it's you should be able to understand it. Actually, it occurs to me there is a book that I would recommend to indie devs if they're looking at publishers, because it has, and it's the best thing I've seen for sort of explaining what you need to know about publishing contracts and the law around game dev and such. And probably the only thing I trust on that. I wouldn't go to random blogs or anything like that. But it's called Video Game Law. Everything you need to know about legal and business issues in the game industry. It's by Boyd, Pine, and Kane, and it is on Amazon. And it'll be like probably around $20. I forget what it is, but this is the book I would recommend to indie devs to read so that they understand what they're getting into. The people who wrote it are veterans of game industry law, and they do a great job of explaining keeping things simple enough to understand without actually simplifying away any important details.
All right, good. Well, we'll definitely put that in the show notes. So for anybody listening who really wants to dive in deep and get a much clearer and better understanding of everything that they would be getting involved with, we'll put that book there, Video Game Law. All right.
Yep.
Awesome. So I know we're coming to time here. So as we close, I mean, we covered definitely quite a bit today. And I was just hoping if you could, share any suggestions or tips that we just like as a quick recap that you would recommend indie devs to consider based on our discussion today.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, summarizing sort of what we've talked about, I would say evaluate your game situation. Look at where you're headed without a publisher. Do some projections, see what that looks like. And then if you decide that you want to talk to publishers, be selective. Make sure they're the kind of publishers who've delivered results in the past. And then make sure that when you negotiate a deal with them, it's the kind of deal that adds value, and game out the scenarios. And you should have, open up an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets and aim out sort of like pessimistic, middle ground, and optimistic projections if you don't have a publisher. And then do the same things with the publisher. And any number the publisher tells you is like, oh yeah, we could probably do that. That's your optimistic one. Go lower for the other. Take their projections with a grain of salt. Do your own estimations and do them based on what that publisher achieved in the past. And then go through the contract terms and the amounts going to who, and analyze how the money changes under the three scenarios. And also, frankly, analyze the time frame and really look hard at terms that don't seem significant, but they actually are, like that quarterly payments provision, which can be a key for cash flow. Really just look at every provision in the contract. And yes, have a lawyer analyze it with you. Absolutely should. But know you're going to care more about your own business and know more about what you need than anyone ever will. So you should be staring at that contract for hours and reading it and thinking about how every provision could go wrong and how it impacts how much you make, the timing at which you make money, your ability to do things. And then at the end of all that, if the publisher isn't adding clear value, don't go with them. Just do it on your own. If that's if you've got good enough projections, you monitor success on your own. If you're headed towards a moderate success, don't be afraid to just say that's good enough, and don't go chasing the dream of the highest success or what the heights of sales that could possibly be achieved. Sometimes it's better just take a good success and make sure that you do well and you're there to go on to game number 2.
Yeah, those all great and amazing points. And Tim, again, I can't thank you enough for being here today. But before we go, what is the best way that people could learn more about you, reach out to you, your website? Where can people get in touch?
Well, I'm pretty boring myself, but if they wanted to, and the website needs an overhaul because I put it up a year ago in 10 minutes on WordPress. But there are pictures of my dog on it, so that's always a plus, right? Me with my dog, my wife with my dog, with our other dog actually. She got the Beagle, I took the Pyrenees. But yeah, we've got Twitter. There. I mean, the thing is, honestly, most of my social media is probably going to be talking about our games, because that's what we do as a publisher. We promote our games. I don't really, talk much other than being on this podcast about sort of like advice to devs or anything, because my audience, my social media audience is mostly gamers who are interested in our, strategy games. So I'm Sure, follow me if you like, but mostly be following for strategy games. But anyone's always welcome to, if you actually something more relevant to you, if you like to reach out and talk, you can. I tell you what, my personal email is Tim, my first name, at hoodedhorse.com. Anyone's welcome to email me there. We also have a team email and a publishing email up on the website. People can send messages to. If anyone wants to chat about things, I'm always open for chatting.
All right, great. So as Tim said, he's that personal email for him is at tim@hoodedhorse.com. And I believe the for publishing, for anybody who's creating like a strategy game that which is your focus, publishing at hoodedhorse.com is another one they could reach out to, correct?
That's right. Yep.
All right, perfect. Well, Tim, really appreciate the insights that you shared with us today, because honestly, I think there's a lot that we uncovered that is going to be really helpful for people when they getting close to whether they're thinking about publishing or getting close to a possible agreement, or they're in the process of negotiation. So again, can't thank you enough for being on the show.
I enjoyed it very much, Andrew.
Hey, everyone, and thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. A special thanks to Taisuke Kimura for creating the show's theme and Donnie Wilson for the logo design. If you enjoy and value the content, you can support us by visiting our Patreon, which is patreon.com/IGM podcast, and select a tier that meets your needs. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com/the number of this episode. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. So if you're looking for a helpful marketing content or marketing plan template for your current game, then please visit rengenmarketing.com. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.